When I got the job as a caretaker at the Blood Moon Observatory, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. The pay was decent, the hours were quiet, and the location, perched on a remote mountaintop surrounded by dense forest, seemed like the perfect place to clear my head. I didn't think much of the name at first. Blood Moon Observatory. It sounded dramatic, sure, but a lot of places lean into the whole spooky aesthetic to draw in visitors. But this wasn't that kind of place. On my first day, the director handed me a folder labeled Caretaker Guidelines. His face was grim as he slid it across the desk, his fingers lingering on the edges like he didn't want to let it go. "Follow these rules exactly," he said, his voice low and clipped. "This job isn't just about maintenance, it's about survival." I thought he was joking. He wasn't. By the time the sun set that night, I'd already broken one of the rules. And I knew, deep in my gut, that I might not live to see another sunrise. I needed the job. After losing my last gig at the university's maintenance department, my savings had evaporated faster than I expected. Bills were piling up, and living with my parents at 30 wasn't exactly the fresh start I'd hoped for. So, when I came across the listing for a caretaker position at the Blood Moon Observatory, I applied without thinking twice. Remote location? Fine by me. Quiet hours? Even better. I wasn't picky anymore. The drive up was unsettling. The observatory was perched high on a mountain, accessible only by a narrow, winding road that seemed to go on forever. The dense forest pressed in on either side, the towering trees casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward me. My GPS cut out halfway up, leaving me to rely on an old, faded map the observatory had emailed me. When I finally saw the building, it took my breath away. The observatory sat at the edge of a rocky cliff, its massive dome gleaming faintly under the blood-red light of the setting sun. The surrounding area was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. The inside wasn't much better. The main hall smelled faintly of metal and mildew, and the dim lighting flickered just enough to make the shadows on the walls seem alive. I met Hal, the director, in a cramped office cluttered with charts, old books, and strange instruments I didn't recognize. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept in days. "This place has history," he said, sliding a thick folder across the desk toward me. "Most of it's not in the official records. You'll understand soon enough." There was something in his voice, something heavy, almost like regret. By the time I left his office, I couldn't shake the feeling that the observatory wasn't just a building. It felt alive, its walls humming faintly, like it was breathing. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it already knew me. I didn't take the rules seriously at first. They were typed on a single sheet of paper, tucked into the back of the folder Hal had given me. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "Caretaker Guidelines, Blood Moon Observatory." Underneath, there was a warning. Failure to comply with these rules may result in severe consequences. I rolled my eyes. It felt overly dramatic, like something out of a bad horror movie. But as I read further, my stomach began to tighten. Rule 1. The observatory lights must remain on at all times between 7 p.m. and 6 a.m. If a bulb burns out, replace it immediately. Do not leave any room in darkness. Rule 2. If the telescope aligns itself without your input, do not look through it. Turn it away manually and lock its position. Rule 3. The red phone in the control room may ring between midnight and 2 a.m. If it does, answer only on the third ring. Do not speak unless prompted, and hang up immediately after the voice stops. Rule 4. At exactly 3:33 a.m., lock the observatory doors and do not look outside, no matter what you hear. Rule 5. If you hear footsteps on the spiral staircase, remain seated and still. Do not turn around until they stop. Rule 6. The logbook must be filled out before sunrise. Write only what you observe. Do not include any personal thoughts or interpretations. By the time I'd finished reading, my hands were sweating. The rules weren't just strange, they were unsettlingly specific, like they were written in response to something. I asked Hal about them before I left his office. He didn't meet my eyes, just muttered something about protocol and waved me off. "Just follow them," he said. "You'll be fine." But his voice didn't sound convincing. As I stood in the dimly lit hallway later that night, staring at the red phone on the wall, I couldn't help but wonder, who or what had these rules been written for? The first night started quietly, too quietly. The observatory hummed with a low, constant vibration, a sound so faint that I almost convinced myself it was normal. I walked the halls with a flashlight, making sure every light was on and checking for burned-out bulbs. The rules said not to leave any room in darkness, and I wasn't about to test why. By midnight, I had settled in the control room. The massive telescope loomed overhead, its sleek metal frame glowing faintly under the red emergency lights. Everything felt still, almost frozen in time. And then I heard it. A soft creak echoed from the spiral staircase down the hall. I froze, the pen in my hand hovering over the logbook. The sound came again, louder this time, like someone testing the weight of each step. I leaned back in my chair, my eyes fixed on the doorway. The staircase wasn't visible from where I sat, but I didn't need to see it to know something, or someone, was there. The rules flashed in my mind. If you hear footsteps on the spiral staircase, remain seated and still. Do not turn around until they stop. My heart pounded as the creaking grew louder, each step deliberate and slow. I gripped the edge of the desk, my breath coming in shallow bursts. And then it stopped. I sat there for what felt like hours, my muscles tense and my mind racing. When I finally found the courage to move, I grabbed the flashlight and peeked into the hallway. The staircase was empty. The air felt heavier, colder, like someone or something had just left. The next incident happened around 1 a.m. I was checking the telescope, making sure it was locked in position, when I noticed something strange. The lens was moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the massive telescope was turning on its own. The motor wasn't running, and I hadn't touched the controls. My pulse quickened as the lens aligned itself with the night sky, pointing directly at the blood-red moon hanging low on the horizon. The rule was clear: do not look through the telescope if it aligns itself. Turn it away manually and lock its position. My hands shook as I grabbed the controls, forcing the telescope to swivel back to its neutral position. The lens resisted at first, like something was pulling against me, but eventually it relented. As I locked the position, I caught a glimpse of the lens's reflection. For a split second, I thought I saw a face staring back at me, pale, featureless, and impossibly close. By 2 a.m., the red phone rang. The sound was sharp and jarring, cutting through the silence like a knife. I froze, my eyes darting to the phone mounted on the wall. The rules said to answer on the third ring, and I counted each one with a growing sense of dread. When the third ring came, I picked up the receiver, my hand trembling. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. At first, there was nothing but static. Then, a voice, low and distorted, like it was speaking from underwater. "Watch the sky," it said. Before I could respond, the line went dead. I hung up the phone and turned back to the logbook, my mind racing. The humming in the walls grew louder, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to match the pounding of my heart. The observatory felt different now, like it was alive, watching me. By the time the clock struck 3 a.m., I wasn't sure if I could make it through the night. At 3:15 a.m., the observatory's hum shifted. It wasn't just a vibration anymore. It became a low, droning sound that I could feel in my chest. The air around me seemed to thicken, making it harder to breathe. The rules said to lock the doors at 3:33 a.m. and not to look outside no matter what I heard. I double-checked the clock, 15 minutes left. I paced the control room, every muscle in my body coiled with tension. The logbook sat open on the desk, its blank pages daring me to write something, anything. I scribbled down what I'd heard on the phone, watch the sky. But the moment my pen left the paper, the lights flickered. The humming grew louder, shaking the walls of the observatory. I ran to check the bulbs, my flashlight cutting through the flickering darkness. One of the hallway lights had burned out. I grabbed a replacement bulb from the supply closet, my hands trembling as I unscrewed the dead one. The rule was clear: no room could be left in darkness. but the shadows in the hallway seemed to move on their own, stretching and twisting as I worked. I told myself it was just my imagination. When I screwed the new bulb into place, the shadows froze. For a moment, everything was still. And then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, a figure stood perfectly still. Its body was wrapped in shadows, its face obscured. But its eyes, they glowed faintly, like dim embers in the dark. I didn't run. I couldn't. My legs felt like they were made of stone, my body rooted to the spot. The figure tilted its head, its movements jerky and unnatural. It stepped closer, the sound of its footsteps echoing loudly in the silent hall. The rules: stay seated, don't move until the footsteps stop. But I wasn't at my desk. I was in the middle of the hallway, exposed. The figure stopped a few feet away from me, its glowing eyes fixed on mine. It reached out a hand, long and spindly, its fingers almost skeletal. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet and falling to the ground. The flashlight rolled out of my hand, its beam flickering wildly across the walls. When I looked up, the figure was gone. I scrambled back to the control room, slamming the door behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I locked the door, my mind racing. I glanced at the clock. 3:29 a.m. 4 minutes? The hum grew louder, vibrating through the walls. It felt like the observatory was alive, its pulse matching my own. The telescope began to move again, aligning itself with the blood-red moon. The rule said not to look through it, but something about the movement felt deliberate, like it was trying to show me something. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the controls. Then, against every instinct, I leaned in and looked through the lens. At first, all I saw was the moon, its surface glowing with an unnatural light. But then the image shifted. I saw the observatory from above, its dome surrounded by a swirling mass of shadows. The shadows moved like a living thing, writhing and pulsating as they closed in on the building. And then I saw myself. I was sitting in the control room, staring into the telescope, but there was something wrong with the image. My reflection wasn't moving. It was staring directly at me, its eyes glowing faintly, just like the figure in the hallway. The reflection smiled. I stumbled back from the telescope, my heart pounding. The logbook had fallen off the desk, its pages fluttering as if caught in a breeze. When I picked it up, I noticed something strange. The pages were filled with writing. Entries I didn't remember making. They detailed events from earlier in the night, things I hadn't even seen. 3 a.m., the caretaker answered the phone. The voice warned them to watch the sky. Over Britain. 3:15 a.m. The shadows began to move. The figure appeared in the hallway. The door opened. 3:33 a.m. The caretaker looked through the telescope. They broke the rule. I stared at the last line, the ink still wet. The clock struck 3:33 a.m. That was when the observatory doors creaked open, the sound echoing through the control room. I froze, the logbook slipping from my hands. The rule said not to look outside, but the sound was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the doors creaking, it was footsteps, heavy and deliberate, making their way toward me. The figure from the hallway stepped into the control room, its glowing eyes locked on mine. It reached out a hand, and I knew, in that moment, that I had made a terrible mistake. The footsteps were deliberate, each one a hammer against my nerves. They grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the control room door. The air in the room thickened, pressing down on me like I was submerged under water. My pulse thundered in my ears, but I didn't dare move. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the hallway beyond. Shadows spilled into the room, stretching unnaturally as they pooled around the doorway. And then it stepped in. The figure wasn't fully human. Its body shifted, flickering between shapes like a distorted signal on a broken screen. Its face, if you could call it that, was a pale mask, featureless except for those glowing eyes that bored into me. Unquote. The humming that had filled the observatory all night grew deafening, a pulsating drone that seemed to sync with the creature's every move. The telescope behind me began to vibrate, the lens focusing itself on the blood-red moon again. I backed into the desk, my hands fumbling for anything I could use to defend myself. My fingers brushed against the logbook, and I grabbed it without thinking. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum. The figure tilted its head, its movements sharp and unnatural. Its glowing eyes seemed to pierce through me, like it was reading my thoughts. And then it spoke. Not with words, but with the hum itself. The vibrations in the air shaped into something I could understand, an impossible voice that filled my mind with words I didn't want to hear. "You broke the rules. You invited it in." I looked down at the logbook in my hands. The pages were blank now, the ink from earlier completely gone. The figure took another step toward me, and the hum grew sharper, like the edge of a blade pressing against my skin. Desperation clawed at my chest. I knew I had to act, but I didn't know how to fight something like this. My eyes darted to the telescope. The rule had been clear: don't look through it. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't meant to protect me. Maybe it was meant to protect it. The figure lunged forward, its movements jagged and chaotic. I had seconds to decide. I threw myself toward the telescope, gripping the controls with trembling hands. The figure let out a sound, a shriek that wasn't a sound at all, but a pressure that made my head feel like it would split open. I forced the telescope's lens to align with the figure, centering its impossible form in the scope. The humming stopped, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like the world itself had paused. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the figure began to unravel. Its body convulsed, the shadows surrounding it pulling away like smoke caught in a strong wind. The glowing eyes dimmed, flickering like dying embers. It reached out toward me, its hand trembling, and for the first time, I saw something almost human in its movements. "Did you do?" But I didn't stop. The telescope's lens began to crack, spiderweb fractures spreading across the glass as the figure dissolved into nothingness. The hum returned, softer now, like a distant echo, and then it was gone. I collapsed to the floor, my body shaking with exhaustion. The observatory felt different, lighter almost, but I knew it wasn't over. The clock read 3:57 a.m. I had 6 minutes to lock the doors. I stumbled to my feet, my legs weak and unsteady, and made my way to the entrance. The key was cold in my hand as I turned it in the lock, securing the observatory just as the rules had instructed. But as I turned back toward the control room, I felt it, the faintest breath of air, on the back of my neck. I wasn't alone. The silence was suffocating. I leaned against the locked door, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The humming was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt almost worse. But the feeling of being watched hadn't left. I turned slowly, scanning the empty observatory. The control room was just as I'd left it. Papers scattered, the telescope cracked and useless. Everything seemed normal, until I saw the reflection. The window overlooking the cliff caught my eye. At first, it seemed like nothing, just my tired face staring back at me. But then, the reflection moved, and I didn't. The version of me in the glass smiled, its eyes glowing faintly, just like the figure from the hallway. My breath caught in my throat as it raised a hand, waving slowly. I stumbled back, my mind racing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. The glass cracked. A voice whispered behind me, low and familiar. "You broke the rules." I spun around, but no one was there. The observatory felt wrong again, the air heavy with something I couldn't name. The logbook lay open on the desk, its pages filled with neat, precise handwriting. My handwriting. 4 a.m. The caretaker locked the doors. The cycle begins again. My blood ran cold. The telescope creaked behind me, its shattered lens aligning itself with the moon. The hum returned, soft at first, then growing louder. The shadows stretched across the walls, pooling at my feet. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The reflection in the window grinned wider, its glowing eyes burning into mine. The voice came again, louder this time, echoing through the room. "You are part of it now." As the clock struck 4:01, the observatory doors unlocked themselves. The air outside howled, and the shadows swallowed me whole. I woke up hours later, slumped at the desk. The logbook sat in front of me, its pages blank except for one line: "Follow the rules." The humming began again, soft and steady, as the telescope shifted its gaze to the blood-red moon. And this time I didn't fight it.